Thanks everybody for joining us today. We are Montana Functional Health, and we are bringing you the second part of our immune Q&A or community Q&A that we're focusing on the immune system and all the key influencers. So I'm going to turn it over to Heather Maddox. She's just going to start us off.
Yeah, thank you again for joining us tonight. For those of you who weren't with us last week, I just want to do some quick introductions. I'm Dr. Heather Maddox, co-founder of Montana Functional Health, and it's a pleasure to be joined by Lindsay Peterson, nurse practitioner, also co-founder of Montana Functional Health, Heidi Moretti, registered dietitian and founder of the Healthy RD, and Carla Alpert, certified health coach and founder of Well Humans. So I want to start this evening talking a little bit about how the immune system functions, and then we're going to get into more of the key influencers of the immune system, including gut health, diet, stress, and sleep. But again, just a few things I want to start with just to kind of lay the groundwork of how the immune system normally functions, which will kind of help us as we talk more in the future about some of the things that interact with it and can cause some imbalance. The immune system is designed to defend against foreign invaders and repair injuries. Those are really its two main jobs. And normally it's in a watchful waiting mode, only reacting to dangerous strangers. It should respond appropriately to the level of threat in a highly controlled fashion with an off switch. And when our immune system is in a healthy state, it can differentiate between self and non-self. This is really important as we look forward to when that doesn't happen or when that gets out of balance. And another key issue here is it has to be tolerant. We have trillions of bacteria that live in our gut, that live in our skin. We don't want the immune system to attack and go after those bacteria. It really should only be responding to actual threats for our health. The immune system is located all throughout the body, head to toe. It's lining our mucous membranes in our nose, in our throat, in our lungs. It's underneath our skin. We have lymph nodes, of course, in our neck, in our armpits, in our groin. Actually, our breast area has a huge amount of lymphatic channels. And then we also have organs like our tonsils, bone marrow, spleen, all of which are playing a role here. There are two main components to the immune system: our innate immunity and acquired immunity. Innate immunity is what we're born with. This is not something we need a vaccine for. It's a very quick response to deal with a foreign invader. But then we also have the acquired immunity, which is something that we learn over time. When we do see different viruses and bacteria, this is kind of a slower response, but it's a more controlled response. And as we deal with these things over time, that acquired immunity allows us, if we see it again, to mount a better response. When we see something foreign that potentially could hurt us, or let's say have a damage to our tissues, what the immune system does is mount an acute inflammatory response. This is a very controlled response. It's very complex. There's multiple cells signaling to each other that there's a problem. And usually what happens, especially let's say in the setting of tissue damage, is you get localized redness, you get swelling. It can be painful, uncomfortable, but it's self-limiting. It's something that should go away once the tissue has been repaired, or in the case of a foreign invader, these types of acute inflammatory responses can happen throughout the body. But ultimately, once that invader is taken care of, we should go back to that normal, inert, kind of restful state. So what happens with chronic inflammation is either it's a chronic injury or chronic, let's say like with tendonitis, a repetitive injury, or it's a failure for the immune system to turn off. And that's really a key concept as we think about chronic disease down the road. Chronic inflammation is a huge role to play in that. If the immune system fails to turn off, it becomes intolerant, and this leads to an overactivity. Various things can factor into this. Genetics can somewhat determine how active our immune system. Some of us are born with a more hyperactive immune system than others. Survival-wise, that was actually a very good thing. Years and years, most of what people died from was infection. So having a more tendency towards an overactive immune system actually gave you a survival benefit. As time has gone on, though, what we're finding is the different foods we're exposed to, especially inflammatory foods like sugars, the different toxins, imbalances in our gut, stress, those can predispose us to also having an overactive immune system, and especially in those of us genetically predisposed to that combination can prove to be a problem. you know, it really can be a setup for chronic inflammation. And you know, most chronic disease is linked to some degree to chronic inflammation. This is very evident when we start looking at autoimmune disease. You know, autoimmune disease is a situation where the immune system is chronically turned on, it's lost the ability to identify self from non-self, and it starts attacking its own tissues. You know, the most common autoimmune disease is Hashimoto's thyroiditis, and that's where the immune system is attacking thyroid tissue. It's seeing, unfortunately, something that should be normal tissue as foreign. It's treating it just like an outside virus. So really the key is we want to try to avoid the exposures that can cause the immune system to get more overactive and try to restore balance. You know, lifestyle and diet are really the two main influencers that contribute to this. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Lindsay to talk a little bit more about gut health and its influence on the immune system.
Thanks, Heather. So yeah, like Heather said, I'm going to talk about gut health and the immune system. And I'm sure some of you are wondering, how does the gastrointestinal system and the immune system, how are they even related? Well, it's interesting because 70% of our body's immune cells are actually housed in the gut lining. So it's pretty impressive the role that our gut actually plays in the immune system. And this is actually why in functional medicine, we focus so heavily on gut health and restoration. So we have this thing called the microbiome, and I'm sure a lot of you have heard of it. It has had a lot of attention in the last few years. There's lots of studies out about it, and those studies are really showing how the microbiome can affect our overall health and wellness. So when we talk about what the microbiome is, we kind of think of it as like a coral reef or maybe a bustling city or something that just has a lot of integral moving parts that work synergistically together to create a functioning ecosystem. So the microbiome is basically made of 100 trillion organisms and 1,000 different species, of different species. It's very biodiverse. There's no two people that have the same microbiome. And this is also why in functional medicine we focus on a personalized approach, because we realize the importance of individualized care and working with people on making sure that they have their own personalized care plan. So the microbiome is influenced by many factors, and it changes throughout our lifetime. So a healthy microbiome is really something that is rich and diverse in the number of organisms and the species that are present. And there's really a balance here that affects our overall health and wellness. And even the day-to-day activity, they're finding that the microbes themselves, what they're doing day-to-day, really affects our immunoregulation. And we'll talk more about that next week. And I wanted to get into just a quick quote and read something from Dr. Martin Blazer. He is the author of Missing Microbes, How the Overuse of Antibiotics is Fueling Our Modern Plagues. And if you haven't read that book, it's a really good one to read. But he says, it is reasonable to propose that the composition of our microbiome and its activities are involved in most, if not all, of the biological processes that constitute human health and disease. So it's a pretty powerful statement just on how important the microbiome is overall. But a healthy microbiome balances our immune system, and our immune system balances our microbiome. So remember that what Heather said, that a healthy immune system is one that is ready to act, but it's not overactive like we see in autoimmune diseases. And then when we think about what a healthy microbiome is, I guess we can talk about kind of what an unhealthy one is in the way that we call that dysbiosis. And so that's actually when the microbiome is imbalanced and disrupted. So you can think of this as there's too many bad bacteria, or there's maybe too little of the good bacteria, or maybe there's enough good bacteria, but there's just, they're growing in the wrong place. So when we think about that, we think of small intestine bacterial overgrowth, or SIBO. And there's lots of causes for dysbiosis. Like Heather said before, diet and lifestyle, we keep going back to that because it's such a key player in so many things, but the biggest kind of components on that are stress and diet. We also look at people's genetics, and family history is playing a role in this. We look at early colonization. So this is like whether you were born through vaginal birth, or maybe you came into the world via C-section. Also, if you were breastfed or bottle fed, this all plays a role. And then as we get older, the influences in our lives, like what antibiotics were we exposed to, different diseases we were exposed to, hygiene and toxins, things like that can really cause this dysbiosis that I'm talking about. And the problem with dysbiosis is it can lead to an increase or a decrease in immune activation, which both have their problems. And then it can lead to increased inflammation. And then it can always also lead to something called intestinal permeability or leaky gut. And I'm going to talk about that next week because it's such a huge topic. But it really is an important piece to this whole thing, because this gut lining barrier that we have, it is the physical separation between our microbiome and our immune system. And the two components, while they work synergistically together, they need that physical barrier to make sure that they're not really seeing each other or fighting each other. So I don't know if hopefully that makes sense, but we just need to have that intact gut lining and barrier. And when that happens, it's able to keep us in an overall health. And when the gut barrier is breached, then it leads to all sorts of diseases. So we think of autoimmune diseases, we think of obesity, we think of allergies, we think of irritable bowel disease. So again, we'll get more into leaky gut because it's such a big topic that it just needs its own amount of time, but we'll do that next week. But as far as this whole microbiome and gut lining and the health of all that, really the next key players to that, plus the immune system, are diet and stress. So I'm going to let Heidi talk about diet and its influence, and then Carla can talk about stress.
Yeah, thanks, Lindsay. And I think diet plays such a big role, as both Lindsay and Heather had talked about, and the things that we can think about in just a simplistic way when you're putting food in your gut, which is controlling most of your immune system. It's got a very powerful impact in that direction. And so I just thought I'd give you a good example of a particular food that can even increase both innate and your adaptive immune system. And that's certain kinds of edible mushrooms, for example. And while some mushrooms or fungus isn't good for you, there are some that are very beneficial in that regard. So mushrooms are healing in a lot of ways. They're super nutritious. Those nutrients in a food like that help to heal and seal that gut lining that both Lindsay and Heather were talking about. Is so key to our immune system. And so, mushrooms, and there's many examples, but in today's world, we have to also think about zinc and the realities of immune issues that are going on today. You might have even seen in the news about zinc, and it's been kind of just glazed over from what I can tell about where do we get zinc. It's in, really nutrient-rich foods, things like oysters, grass-fed beef, things like that are really rich. And when it comes to, eating zinc, there's some things that go on in the body that we need to be aware of too. The zinc can't just be absorbed into the digestive lining. It has to get inside the cell. And that's where some key players in foods come in too. So that's where the plant chemicals or the antioxidants that you hear all the rage about that are so good for your immune system too. So things that are rich in quercetin help balance out immune system in numerous ways. So quercetin is an antioxidant, rich in things like onions and apple skins, things like that. So now these foods aren't good for everyone, so that's why, like mentioned before, we do a tailored approach for the individual. But when you eat a very nutrient, antioxidant rich diet, it goes a long way to healing the gut and helping the immune system respond, not over in a chronic way, but in a very responsive way to the invaders we want it to. So, so that's a little bit about looking at, gut healing. And of course, we get into the idea of fermented foods. It's a huge topic, which we'll probably get into some more next week. Fermented foods being, I'll just give you a couple, kimchi, sauerkraut, two of my very favorites. And then some key nutrients, like besides zinc, are vitamin D. Vitamin D being a sunshine factor, but it's also in oily fish, especially like wild caught fish, and mostly sunlight. And so it's been getting a lot of attention in the news for good reason lately. So nutrients like that, selenium, selenium helps our body fight a virus in an effective way. Selenium coming from certain things like meats and nuts. So looking at that. And then, as you guys both mentioned before, Heather and Lindsay, that inflammation is usually the driving force behind the imbalance of our immune system. And many healing foods can come to play in helping reduce that inflammation in the body. A couple of my favorites are broccoli sprouts and turmeric. Pretty potent and unusual foods, but they pack a anti-inflammatory punch. There's so many on that healing food list, but I'll pass it along to Carla, because I know that stress management and the immune system, in my personal experiences, played a huge role in getting over some of my even allergies, surprisingly, because when we're stressed out, our body's not appropriately responding to anything. And so with that, Carla, you want to take it from here?
Sure. Thank you, Heidi. Hi, everyone. So you just heard a little bit about the gut and the diet and how they influence the immune system. And now I'm going to talk a little bit about stress, like Heidi said. And I think most of you know that there's a connection between your stress levels and your health. But I'm going to explain the connection a little bit better so that you understand what that means. So stress is really anything that you perceive as a threat. And this could be from some obvious stress, like a serious illness or an accident or surgery, but as well, it comes from smaller daily events like traffic or work. But stress can also be from hidden threats like unknown infections or imbalances or food triggers. And stress in any form can interfere with your health, creating sleep issues, causing fatigue, weight gain, and also by weakening your immune system. But the good news is that your body is naturally designed to deal with stress. And as an example, if you come across a tiger, your body goes into fight, flight, or freeze mode to protect you from that tiger. And your stress hormones, adrenaline and cortisol, and they increase in reaction to that threat. And at the same time, your digestion stops and your blood pressure and heart rate go up so that you're able to do what you need to do to protect yourself, which is either run for your life, fight back, or play dead. But after the threat is gone, in this case, the tiger is gone, your body goes back to its normal function. And this is completely normal and does not impact the immune system. But in today's world, it seems that many of us are in constant threat from everyday occurrences like our busy schedules and family demands and relationships, or as I already mentioned, the hidden threats like infections and food intolerances or imbalances that go undetected over a period of time. And our body can't sustain this chronic stress pattern, and then we end up depleted, we're not sleeping well, we're exhausted, we're wired and tired, with the inability for our immune system to fight off infections as well. And this all means that in order to maintain a strong immune system, to sleep well and heal your body, that working on stress reduction is also part of the bigger picture, like everyone else was saying already too. And a few simple things that you can do to lower your stress levels are just get outside in nature every day and just really recognize all the beauty around you. And move your body every day. You don't want to do too much or too little. Over-exercising or overdoing it while you're tired or sick is also a major stressor to your body. And deep breathing techniques are also super helpful to bring your body back into that rest and digest and healing state. And later in the webinar series, I'm going to be sharing some specific breathing exercises with you. And I hope to see you there so we can all practice them together. So I talked a little bit about stress and sleep before and how it affects your immune system. And now Heather's going to talk more about sleep and how the immune system specifically interact. So take it away.
So much, Carla. So I wanted to spend a few minutes just talking about, what is normal sleep and kind of laying that foundation. Usually with sleep, the ideal would be to be able to fall asleep within 30 minutes, to stay asleep all throughout the night, to not wake up too early, and to ultimately feel refreshed when we do wake up. It is fairly common to get up some during the middle of the night, certainly go to the bathroom, but we should be able to get back to sleep fairly quickly. When we sleep, we go through about 4 different phases that we cycle through. Several that are lighter sleep, get into REM sleep or rapid eye movement, sleep, and then deep sleep. And we should cycle through these throughout the night as well. We don't all need the same amount of sleep, but ideal is between about 7 to 9 hours a night. And one thing that's really critical is the timing. Ideally, you want to sleep between about 10 to 11 p.m. and get up around 6 to 7 a.m. I know right now everyone's schedules are off. A lot of times folks don't have to get up in the morning like they used to. I know my teenage son is definitely on a different sleep schedule right now, going to sleep later, getting up later. And even though he may, for example, be getting 8 hours of sleep, it really is critical to sleep during that certain time. We ideally want to be asleep in the night and awake during the day. This sleep and circadian rhythm, or 24-hour sleep-wake cycle, work in tandem to keep our immune system healthy. When we are awake, that's actually when our innate immune system is the most active. And it kind of makes sense. If we're outside playing and we get hurt, we want that innate immune system to be able to act quickly. That's when we're more likely to be exposed to people and maybe different viruses or bacteria. So it makes sense that the innate immune system would be the most active when we're awake and during daylight hours. In contrast, when we're asleep, that's actually when the acquired or adaptive immunity kicks in. That's our memory, that immunological memory. And so in the evening, that's when that side of our immune system is the most active. So if we don't sleep well, over time especially, what starts to happen is we get deficiencies in the immune system, and it also sets us up for chronic inflammation. Just even taking away as much as 30 minutes of sleep a night will actually increase something called C-reactive protein, which is a marker of inflammation. In the next few weeks, and actually I think towards our last session, I'm going to get into a lot more detail about sleep, and especially the effects of poor sleep on chronic inflammation. With that, though, I'd like to go ahead and open it up to our question and answer session.
Yes, if you guys have questions, just type them in the chat box there and we can get to them. And if there are too many, we'll make sure that we address them on Facebook with the question and then your answer within the week. We did have some come in through email, so I'll probably just start with those and just let some of the other ones trickle in. But the first one was, how do you test to know if the microbiome is healthy? So I know Heather's going to speak a little bit on this, but I'm going to start it off just to answer this question because we're going to get to a little bit more of that later. But we end up doing comprehensive stool analysis for a lot of patients, just because, like I said earlier, our microbiomes are not, there's no two people that have the same microbiome, so we can't just guess at how it looks. We need to kind of know what it looks like. So the comprehensive stool analysis really gives us an overview of how things are going. So it looks at the different microbes that are present in the different species. It also can give us the number of organisms within those species or colonies. So that's really important for us to know, because like I was saying earlier, if you have too few good bacteria, then we want to beef that up with usually probiotics. We also want to feed them with good prebiotics and foods. And so another thing we look at is it contains different viruses. We look for parasites that might be present that we can get rid of, causing a whole host of problems. We look for yeast overgrowth, and there's different issues and symptoms that patients come to us with that make us think potential for yeast overgrowth. So it kind of gives us this nice overview of what people have going on. It's much different than if you go into a conventional setting and you get some stool testing done. Obviously, they're looking for parasites and they're looking for some things like that. But this really goes deeper in identifying a lot of different species that are present in the stool. So we utilize that test often for patients just to get an overview of how things look. And if I forgot anything, Heather, let me know, or any of you.
Yeah, I think too, with the stool test, like Lindsay was saying, it's amazing just even in the past year how these tests are just growing by leaps and bounds. Like in the conventional side, if I was to test someone for ova or parasites, it literally just says yes or no, and barely gives you much on species identification. With these comprehensive stool analyses, you get a list of 30 or 40 parasites that it's checking. It's just much more in depth. And it also, as we keep talking about this key issue of chronic inflammation, there's a lot of different ways you can check for that, but the stool is one way. Some of the markers, it tells us very specifically if there's inflammation kind of along that gut wall, like we've been talking about, how important that barrier is. And, it gives us also a little insight. There's something called a secretory IgA in the stool analysis, and that starts to give you some insight too whether the immune system is maybe a little ramped up because there is something inflammatory going on in that gut wall, or if it's maybe not ramped up enough, if it's suppressed.
Perfect. And then, let's see. How do you know if someone has the potential for an overactive immune system?
So there's, again, many different ways you can check for that. There is a relatively simple lab test that can be done pretty much in any lab. And usually a primary care physician can order this called a C-reactive protein. And there's also something called an HS-CRP, or high sensitivity C-reactive protein. And that just gives just a number, gives you a look at whether there's inflammation in the bloodstream, especially the high sensitivity C-reactive protein. Looks a lot at cardiovascular health, inflammation in the arteries. So that's a relatively simple test. And we really do go by family history. That's one of the things in functional medicine we do, is take a much more detailed history. Any family history, especially of autoimmune disease, let's say history of frequent infections, those types of things can certainly give us a clue, especially in the realm of autoimmune disease. That pretty much right there tells us that genetically that person may have a predisposition to that overactive immune system. So we're really going to want to be proactive at those variables like we've talked about with lifestyle and stress and sleep, food choices. That's one of the real benefits, I think, of functional medicine, is to get on these things early. If we know these things early, we can have a plan rather than sort of waiting and reacting once something has already happened.
Yeah, perfect. And then a question came in that asked, what is SIBO? And I did mention this when I was talking. So small intestine bacterial overgrowth is something that happens when we get into that state of that leaky gut, like I was saying. So we can have the dysbiotic state, where you have one of the ways you can get dysbiosis or have identified dysbiosis is by seeing good organisms that are growing in the wrong place. And so that's when, the majority of our bacteria should be living in the large intestine. But if there's this leaky gut or this intestinal permeability, what happens is there can be an overgrowth into the small intestine, where some of these bacteria they're not supposed to be. And what they'll do is they'll end up sort of ingesting everything that you eat, so it doesn't make it to the large intestine. I mean, it does, but some of it gets ingested by these bacteria, and then they end up off-gassing, like any bacteria does, but they do it in a place that isn't supposed to be happening. So when they off-gas, patients can really feel the effect of kind of this kind of just aching, gnawing, bloating feeling. They can have gas, just other really uncomfortable symptoms that when they come to us and they tell us these things, it makes us think of SIBO, and then it makes us think of leaky gut, because we know that's more of a root cause, and we want to look at that so we can try to fix that root cause. We can also look at fixing SIBO. A lot of times we like to do a gentle approach with an herbal concoction that, depending on if it's a methane dominant SIBO or a hydrogen gas dominant SIBO, meaning that's the type of gas that's being off-gassed, we can address that with an herbal concoction. It's just a little nicer on the system, and a little bit better tolerated for people. So yeah, we have some concoctions with that we end up using to treat it, and it can be really easy to treat in some people who have just developed this, but if it's ongoing and chronic, it can actually be really difficult to treat. So it just depends on the person and what they have going on. There are some conventional ways to treat it. There's some different antibiotics that GI docs will use, and some of them have shown to be effective. Again, it's just varies per person, but also they're really expensive. And we're trying to avoid anything that causes dysbiosis. And if you remember earlier, I was mentioning that antibiotic exposure can do that. So it's just something we like to sort of stay away from if we can. We try the herbal concoctions. If we can't, and we need to head to something more conventional, then we do get people set up with a GI doc if they aren't already, and they can work on that process with sort of their recommendations. But we've seen a lot of success with our herbal concoctions, and changing the diet too is a huge component, because we want to starve out the bacteria. We don't want them flourishing with a meal that they love, with sugar and carbohydrates and things like that they love. So if we can sort of, quote, starve them out, then we can make progress there too. So there's a few ways we address SIBO, but it really does come from that leaky gut, which again, we'll get into more next week, all the details on that. Okay, so another question that came in. So I guess one question that came in was, how do you measure inflammation in the body? And we kind of went through that already. Heather mentioned the HSCRP, which is that inflammation marker you can test through the blood. And then she did touch on this too, but in the stool analysis that I was mentioning earlier, there's something called a calprotectin level, and that's really our inflammatory marker for our GI tract. And then we look at that immune response that's also going on in the GI tract, and that's that secretory IgA level. And so with every comprehensive stool analysis, we look for these markers in everybody just to see, is there an immune reaction going on? Is there an inflammatory response going on? So those are kind of our main ways to measure inflammation, but there's lots of other things we look at too, sort of indirectly. And then, let's see, how do you feel about vaccines? That's a good question.
Yeah, vaccines are definitely on everybody's mind right now, obviously in regards to COVID-19, but there's been a lot of controversy with the vaccines. I think a lot of mothers now, pregnant and having children, there's so many vaccines recommended, and I think it can get a bit daunting to know if is this the right thing to do or not. Certainly vaccines have had, a huge role to play in preventing, illnesses that otherwise would have caused serious complications of people and certainly death. But I think it is controversial, and I think it is worth, at least listening when someone has a concern about vaccines, especially for their kids, but even for themselves, to really listen to their concerns. There's a lot of research being done on this. I think there's still a lot of unanswered questions. But certainly, back to that family history of an overreactive immune system, sometimes if you do give a vaccine in the setting of a hyperactive immune system, you can get more of a pronounced response than you want. And we certainly have all, I think folks have had experiences or known people, for example, who get flu shots, tend to feel worse, get sick from that. So there's definitely some people that really mount a strong response. Whether or not there's any links to this in autism in children and other concerns, again, I think there's still some unanswered questions there. I think a good approach to take potentially if you're concerned about vaccinating your children is maybe, a more prolonged approach, or a, kind of an alternative vaccine schedule. It's not uncommon sometimes to just do a more spread out or individually rather than doing multiple at a time. And that's not necessarily an unreasonable approach. And I think it really is just going to be, talking with your primary care doctor, your pediatrician, if you do have concerns. And some, willing to listen, some not necessarily, but I think, again, it's certainly am still in favor of vaccines, but I think it's worth caution in some people. And if there's certainly concerns, certainly if someone in the family has had a reaction to a vaccine, I think it's important to look at that.
Yeah, that's huge. Good answer. Well, so far that's all of the questions we have. If we have any other ones come up, we are about 3 minutes away anyway, so if we end up ending a little bit early, I don't think that's an issue. But yeah, I haven't seen any other questions come through, so that might be it, guys.
Sounds good.
Yeah. So thanks everybody for coming today and watching this. Hopefully you learned a lot. And next week I guess, Heather, do you want to mention what just next week we're doing? We're talking about more about the food and like diet and things like that in the immune system. Is that right?
Yep. So next week we're going to get into more detail about, Lindsay started introducing some of this tonight with the importance of the intact gut lining, but we're going to get more into the connection between the gut and immune system. Leaky gut, we'll spend definitely a lot more time talking about, is that when that happens, that's really what can set the immune system into that hyperactive state. We'll talk a little bit more also about the microbiome, like so Lindsay gave a fantastic introduction to that tonight. And then foods that feed the microbiome. Again, some of that was talked about tonight, but we're going to get into all these in more detail. Foods that are helpful to the gut bacteria, and again, foods that can sometimes end up creating that dysbiosis or imbalance.
Yep. So join us again. Thank you guys for coming and watching.
Thank you.